Welcome to the Road to Jesus, here with Pastor Fred at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. Today we are covering 1 Chronicles chapter 1 through 1 Chronicles chapter 17. So, you have to love the genealogies, right? I mean, everyone is into them. Well, they are these days. Everyone's tracing their genealogies. Apparently, so is God. Good news, if you got through this week, there are clear skies ahead. Not a lot of genealogies left. So what is it with the book of 1 Chronicles? Most people think this book was written by Ezra, the same guy that wrote the book of Ezra, because where 2 Chronicles leaves off, Ezra takes off. Now, Ezra was a teacher and a scribe in Israel, and we're not certain he wrote it. That's just how people have thought, but he seems a pretty good candidate, and if he didn't write it, then it had to be another Levite that wrote it because of the focus on the temple. The book was written around 450 BC, after the return of the Babylonian exile. Basically, it traces God's kingdom from Adam to Abraham, and then from Saul to David, and then from Solomon to Zerubbabel. Again, the focus is on the temple, where worship is centered. The question is, why was it written, and for who was it written? Remember, the tribe of Judah had just returned from 70 years of exile, and now they had to establish the nation of Israel for themselves as a nation again. Now, notice I use that nation of Israel. We normally use that to refer to the northern tribes, and Judah was the southern tribe. But a lot of times Israel also just includes Judah and that, so it's interchangeable. So we will differentiate between the northern and southern tribe, but basically when Judah came back, they were trying to reestablish them as a nation and Israel basically as a nation, minus those 10 tribes. So just to go back and give some history of how we ended up here in the first place, there are really two big events that occur in the Old Testament. One, the Exodus in 1450 BC. Moses leads the people of Egypt, a people out of Egypt, to fulfill the promise given to Abraham and to his descendants. They were given laws and a covenant, and eventually established themselves in the Promised Land. And there were two great kings, David and Solomon. The temple was also built, among other things, during this time period, and those books take us into about 900 or something BC. The second one was the exile. Remember, even before the exile, the kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. In 723 BC, the northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrian armies, and the people were taken into captivity and dispersed among the foreign nations, never to be heard from again as tribes. As individual people, many of them came back, but as tribes, they were gone. Judah, with only two tribes, was what was left. And they too continued in sin, and between 605 and 586 BC, the Babylonians attacked them and started dragging them into captivity. They ended up living in a foreign land with foreign laws and foreign culture and no temple. This exile lasted 70 years. Finally, in 537 BC, they were allowed to start going back. They started rebuilding the temple. But when the older people saw it, they cried because they remembered the grandeur of the old temple. So people were depressed, disappointed, and wondered if they would ever return to normal. And most of the younger people really didn't know the history or old enough to remember any of it. So these two books of Chronicles were written to build them back up, to restore their hope, and to remind them of their glorious history and how much God had shown them love in the past, and to give those younger people that sense of who they were. It was also to warn them about making the previous mistakes again. So the purpose was really to build them up and give them confidence. And it seems to have worked, because the people of God survived pretty well for the next 400 years before Christ came. One of the most important things that the book was written to keep alive was the fact that the royal descendant of David was still coming. In other words, the Messiah was still coming. Remember, at the time that the book was written, there was no king at all on the throne, much less a descendant of David. Judah, at that time of the writing of the book of Chronicles, was just a backwater town in what was now the Persian Empire. So the writer is very selective in choosing what material he's going to share in his book about David and Solomon and their descendants. Most of their faults are left out, and all the good stuff they did is emphasized. Now, the writer doesn't deny the bad stuff, but he does minimize it. The book basically emphasizes the fact that David and Solomon organized the people around the temple, and therefore the temple's always at the forefront of the story, which tells us something about our relationship with the church today. So let's look at some of these genealogies. In chapter 1, notice some of the names that jump out at you. Adam, Seth, Enoch, Methuselah because of his age, and Noah. These cover the genealogies of Genesis 5, Genesis 10, and Genesis 11. Now notice that Cain and Abel are not mentioned. He instead goes right to the divine line, which starts with Seth. And we have a whole bunch of other names mentioned here, but when we get close to verse 17, we get to Shem. In fact, it goes from Noah to Shem to Abraham. These are the important people. Notice another name that's mentioned is Peleg. So thinking about these main names, we have Noah in the Great Flood. We have Peleg, which is associated with the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, the dividing of the earth. And then we have Abraham, who God set apart to establish the great nation for whom the Savior would come from. See, these genealogies are rich in meaning. They have a reason. Then we run, of course, into Isaac and Jacob. But notice the genealogies of Esau or Edom. Notice how long they are. Why is it that Esau, who's not a child of the promise, gets so much attention? Well, the reason for this is at the time that the book of Chronicles was written, the Edomites were Judah's closest neighbor directly to the south, and it was not a good relationship, to say the least. In David's time, Israel had control over them, but they were always rebelling. But Israel kept control. But when Babylon had attacked Israel, the Edomites had taken advantage, and they had helped the Babylonians tear down the temple. So some bad blood there. So know your enemies. In chapter 2, the focus starts on Judah, the tribe that the Messiah will come from. So who do you recognize in verse 12? Ruth. She was the Moabitess who became the wife of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab the prostitute. In chapter 3, we run into David, and we start to recognize through the genealogies some of the history from the books of Samuel and Kings. Skipping ahead a little bit to chapter 6, we're taken back to Moses. And these genealogies jump back and forth according to certain categories more than they do by chronology. What we see here is the importance of the priesthood and who has control over it. The chronicler goes out of his way to explain that while all the priests are Levites, not all the Levites are priests. To be a priest, you not only had to be a Levite, but you had to be a direct descendant of Aaron. The priesthood is still important after the exile. It keeps them connected to the temple, which they are rebuilding. Now, they had the priests during the exile, but their functions were limited without the temple. That the priests returned with the people after exile was a real comfort to them. And if you look closely, you see a couple names that are excluded. They're listed in 1 Samuel chapter 3, but not here. And these are the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. They were very bad priests, and so they get left out. When we get to chapter 9, we begin to connect those before the exile to those after the exile. And that's important because the people reading the Chronicles needed to see that they were connected with the past and all the things that God had done for his people. Another thing that's important here is in chapter 9 is verses 17 through 34, where it talks about the importance of the Levites. History tells us that the Levites didn't return in large numbers at the start of the return. Many of them who were not in Aaron's line and not priests did not see the point. So the chronicler is pointing out that the Levite positions are important and they need to come back. It also reminds us that a lot of the Jews that were in Babylon that were from Judah never did return. They just stayed in Babylon. They had a good life eventually there. They carried on business and stuff like that. And that's why when you get to the day of Pentecost in the New Testament, you see all these people, Jews coming from foreign nations. And they were all people that decided not to come back to the Promised Land. The life was good, but they still maintained their Jewish religion. So then in chapter 10, the focus of the book changes yet again. The focus of the rest of the book is on David and his line. Now the writer assumes that the audience is familiar with 1 and 2 Samuel. Those books had not disappeared. So he's not just retelling this story, but instead he's sharing the parts which again build the nation up. He leaves out stuff, in other words. I guess the best way to explain it, and then he leaves stuff out particularly with David and Solomon. The best way to explain it is kind of like a father sitting down with his children at the passing of a grandparent. The kids already know most of the stories, including the bad ones. But the father's looking back, reminding the children of the good things about their grandparents, things that will make them proud to be their grandchildren. Kind of put the things that were not so great, not so noble in the past, right? For instance, we only get one chapter on Saul. So there's nothing about David being persecuted or running from him. When he gets to David, there's nothing about his ruling over Judah for 7 years while Saul's relative ruled over the northern tribes. They just assumed David always ruled over everything. He does not talk about how Abner was important in bringing over the northern tribes, and then how he's later ungraciously killed. There's nothing about David's sin with Bathsheba. I mean, as parents, we don't necessarily tell our children about our parents' bad qualities. We emphasize the good about them, right? What's also interesting about chapter 10, is what is said about Saul's death. It is said that the Lord put Saul to death. That's interesting because it shows God's hand in getting rid of Saul so David can take over the kingship. It shows God's direct judgment. Going to chapter 17, which is the end, we find that this is the first time the prophet Nathan is mentioned. Now, he's mentioned many times in 2 Samuel, plays a very important role in confronting David, right? But the Nathan that's pictured here is not so much a prophet of God, but someone giving David advice. His role, in other words, is minimized so that David's role can be made even bigger. And we're not going to hear about David's sin and all the infighting that goes on inside David's house. Those stories do not serve the chronicler's purpose. So I hope you made it through the genealogies with your brain intact. It gets easier now as we finish or start to finish 1 Chronicles and go into 2 Chronicles. Next week we will look at 1 Chronicles chapter 18 to 2 Chronicles chapter 12. Keep reading, and God bless, and thank you for joining us for the Road to Jesus here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. And Pastor Fred, peace out.